Well, hello. My name is George Hart, and I've been teaching a few years, probably longer than I want to think about. And Iqbal asked me to talk to you guys about colonialism today. Now, colonialism isn't really my field, but in a way that's good, because I'm not just going to say the usual things everybody says about colonialism. I'm going to look at it from a different sort of viewpoint. Oh, incidentally, Iqbal, how long do we have?
Class finishes at 3:15.
Huh?
3:15.
Oh, we have till 3:15. Oh, okay. Well, that gives us some time. So I'm not going to go that long, don't worry, but if you guys have any questions or want to have a discussion, which is always a good thing to do about such a difficult topic as colonialism. It's a very vexed topic, and everybody has different things to say, and of course it feeds into all of the things that dominate the news nowadays, like racism and this and that. So we will talk about that. I start out with colonialisms as a plural because there's more than one kind of exploitation that human beings engage in. In fact, there are probably more than this short list, but here are some of the major ones. When you enslave people, and unfortunately most cultures have done that in the past, you obviously are involved in exploitation. You're exploiting the people you have enslaved. And starting with the Greeks, and even in India, slavery was practiced, although it's hard to differentiate slavery from the caste system. We have a couple texts in South India that talk about someone becoming someone's slave. It's not totally clear exactly what that entailed, but we know a lot more about slavery in the West and in other places. We're not talking about slavery today, so we'll move on. Another one is indentured labor, where you ship a bunch of, this happened actually, the British did this to a lot of Indians. They shipped people off to islands like Mauritius and Reunion and maybe Trinidad, I think. And the people weren't technically slaves, but they basically were bound by a contract which they could never pay off, so they were indentured laborers. And it isn't really that different from slavery. Slavery, you don't pay anything. Indentured labor, you pay a little bit, but not enough for the person to be free. So that's what that is. Now, colonialism, of course, is what we're supposed to be talking about today. And there are many, many more books that have been written about colonialism than one can easily count. The reason is that starting about the 16th, 17th century, the various countries in the West reached a kind of material stage where they could have armies and they could go out and conquer other places in the world and exploit them. Now, what exactly does exploitation mean in colonial terms? We'll come to that in a little bit when we talk about India. In other words, why would a small country like the United Kingdom want to go and control this huge country of India? You might think it's obvious, but I don't think so. Because when you go out and you, first of all, did they have the resources to do it? Second of all, what did they gain from it? And, you know, you have to think about what the reasons for it were. Now, one of the reasons was that in Western Europe especially, because most of the colonial powers were in Western Europe, you had the formation of nations in the 18th, 19th century. Germany used to be, in the 18th century, was a bunch of small little duchies or kingdoms. And those were all united under Bismarck. The same thing was true in Italy. Of course, the French had their French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, toward the, and England, well, England is different because it's an island. And as everybody who's been reading about Brexit knows, the English don't like to think of themselves as European. And they've obviously been a country for a long time, but they've also been trying to control other areas, especially Ireland nearby. And they periodically tried to control areas of France. So one of the things that, I mean, you have to look at colonialism a bit like a hurricane, I think. How's that? In other words, for a hurricane, all sorts of different things have to be there for the hurricane to form. And one of the things that has to be there is sense of nationhood. Now, why is nationhood so important? Because people identify with their nation, which in Europe often is their ethnic group, usually is, and then they want to glorify their nation, and they want to feel like because they're in this nation, they're better than other people. Now, what better way to feel better than other people than to have colonies of other people whom you control and who don't have their own freedom? Now, finally, when we come to another kind of exploitation, we're going into a whole different world. And that is the exploitation of caste. And I am going to spend a bit of time talking about caste, which of course is a South Asia phenomenon, because when we get to India, you get an amalgam of colonialism and caste, which has had a very strong effect on the formation of the countries in South Asia and on how they view the world. So we'll come to that in a little bit. So let's start out with what caste is. The standard books are actually wrong. If you read most books about Indian culture, they will tell you that the Vedas were composed, as early as 4,000 years ago, and that the caste system really originated with the Vedas. And how does that work? Well, if you look at the oldest of the Vedas, the Rig Veda, there's a famous hymn in it called the Purusha Sukta. I didn't write that down, but You probably don't need to know Purusha Sukta. Many Hindus recite it every day. But now the Purusha Sukta divided society into, oh, I did write it down. There you are. Divided the society into 4 groups: Brahmins or Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. And this is what you'll read all the time when you read about the Indian caste system. The only problem with it is that it doesn't correspond to reality, and maybe 4,000 years ago among the Vedic tribes it did, but probably not too much other than that. The Brahmins are a kind of priest who learn to recite the Vedas, and actually they're the one member of this group that's still around. There are lots of Indians who claim they're Brahmins, or they don't claim, they are Brahmins. But even though you'd think they're all Brahmins, they don't intermarry. Actually, there are a bunch of castes. There are many castes which are subsumed under the title of Brahmins. So we'll come in a minute to what a caste really is. Kshatriyas are supposed to be warriors, Vaishyas are supposed to be merchants, and Shudras are supposed to be servants. This very neat 4-fold classification doesn't actually work. What we really see in India and other parts of South Asia is Jothee. Jothee is a Sanskrit word. It's cognate with the English word generate, and it means birth. How is one born? Okay, so a caste is actually an endogamous group. Now, what does endogamous mean? Does anybody know what endogamous means? Endogamous means it only marries within itself. So, if you are a such and such caste, a Joth caste, say, in North India, you only will marry a Joth. And in fact, there was an article in the paper the other day about newspaper ads for trying to find matches for your kids. And one of the things always specified in the newspaper ads is the caste. You have to marry into the same group. So then the question is, okay, so that's fine. But what does Jothee have to do with exploitation? We have evidence for Jothee at least to 300 or 400 BCE, but it's probably quite a bit older. We have genetic studies that suggest it goes back that far, because you can study genes of different groups and see how long they've been intermarrying among each other. And it's based on the belief that endogamous community or castes have an inborn ability to do certain tasks. Now, here we have to remember one thing. We're talking about village cultures, because India and the rest of South Asia, sorry, I say India, I really mean India in the old way terms, which includes Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, although Sri Lankans wouldn't like that much, but we can do it just because it's convenient. And in villages, there's a whole bunch of jobs that have to be done. And so you have endogamous groups, potters, washermen, smiths, that is blacksmiths, goldsmiths, fishermen, and so forth. There are lots and lots of these groups. And in fact, what's curious is that many of them are even subdivided. So you may have 2, 3, 4 kinds of washermen, each one of which maybe does a slightly different task. Now to us, this seems a bit odd because that's not how our culture works. You don't, I suppose there was a time when people would often do the same thing their parents did. So there was a tendency that way, but it never got to the way it developed in South Asia. In South Asia, the belief was that each one of these groups is able to do something which other people can't do. In other words, only a person in a fisherman group can really catch fish properly. Otherwise, something will go wrong, the fish won't be auspicious, or they'll rot, or something will happen. So there's not only is this an economic grouping, it's also a ritual grouping. Now, by ritual, what do we mean? We mean that each one of these has its own ritual duty that is there because it needs to be performed, and if it's not performed by the proper people, something bad will happen. So, in order to maintain social order, you have to maintain this system where people don't marry outside of their group. Now, some of these groups, from a long, long time ago, at least 2,000 years ago, and actually even earlier, because we have some mentioned in earlier texts, some of these groups were marginalized. Now, what do we mean by marginalized? We mean that other people didn't want to interact with them because they were considered inauspicious, maybe not clean, maybe low, whatever reason. And some of these groups are leather workers, washermen, funeral performers, drummers, and other performers. Now, why were these groups marginalized? Now, it's not quite this simple, but when we look at some of the old texts, this is pretty much what we see. Now, why were they marginalized? They were associated in some way with death. In other words, they were associated with order going out of the world. And so you get leather worker deals with dead cows. A drummer has a spirit in the drum. Have you ever heard of talking drums? Why do they talk? Well, if you go back far enough in most cultures, it's because there's some kind of spirit in the drum. Of course, we don't think that way anymore, which is probably a good thing, but this is the way a lot of older cultures see things. A performer invokes spirits when he performs or she performs. And finally, a washerman, this is something which wouldn't occur to most people, but it's important, has to deal with garments that have been soiled with menstruous blood because, that's part of the human condition, and somebody has to take care of that. You're in a village, you can't, there's no alternative to washing things. And menstrual blood is thought to be especially problematic among almost all cultures, all pre-modern cultures, because it denotes the failure of fertility in one way, and because it's a substance of the body. So if you look around and think about it, and this is something which people who deal with women's liberation need to be aware of, and that is that in almost all older cultures, there are taboos around women when they're having their periods. And this was even in England up until the 20th century. Women who were in that state were not allowed to can fish because it was thought the fish would spoil. And it's amazing the kind of crazy things people believe, but There it is. Now, these low groups are connected with the spirit world. They need to deal with dangerous forces. Spirit world is the world of the ancestors. And almost all cultures have this belief that when people die, their spirits are out there somewhere. And they're dangerous themselves, they're marginalized, and perhaps also equally important, they are economically exploited. You have upper groups who have the power, and that would be there are a lot of castes which are landowning castes and have great power and they use these marginalized people basically almost as indentured laborers. There'll be some kind of exchange. The Dalits will work for them, and then they'll get so much rice out of a year so they can survive. But they're basically not treated in a way which one would wish other human beings to be treated. And the kinds of discrimination which are now fortunately illegal, actually all of this is prohibited by the Indian Constitution. But in villages, you can't change things very fast, and a lot of this stuff still goes on. They have to live in their own area. They can't wear shoes in upper caste areas. They have limited access to schooling. They can't enter the house of the upper caste, and especially the kitchen. They can't buy productive land. They can't enter temples. They can't sit on buses. I just talked to a guy who told me that. He himself came from that community. They can't use upper caste funeral grounds. They have to drink from a separate vessel. They can't share their food with other upper groups, and they're kept down economically. Now, here we have to step back and point out that the system seems to us horribly discriminatory, and in fact it is, but it's no more discriminatory than systems which existed in many other countries. Peasants in Europe were treated no better than these lower castes. And in Russia, peasants were basically slaves until they were finally freed in the early 19th century. And of course, we don't even need to talk about the US and the horrible history we have in this country of discriminating against people. So, unfortunately, this is something which is found in just about, well, I wouldn't say every culture, but many, many cultures, you get discrimination against certain groups. Now, let's go back to colonialism. And I think one of the things you can imagine is you have Europeans coming in with their superior weapons, and they basically want to make money. But when they come in, they encounter this culture. Now, let me just add something about this culture of India that we've been talking about. Over and above the caste system, there are zillions of things we can talk about when we talk about pre-modern South Asia. And a couple of the things are, to see the other side of the coin, India was, until the 18th century, was the richest place in the world, by far. In the first millennium AD, Indian culture spread over half the world without being imposed by armies and was adopted in part usually, because it's hard to adopt the whole thing. In many areas, in Bali, they still have Hindus who have a system similar to that in India, though it's actually different. But if you look at Angkor Wat or any of those places, they're all very much influenced by Indian culture in the first millennium. And not only that, but the official sort of lingua franca of this culture, which was Sanskrit, was adopted and used by elites in many other places. If you read old Javanese in Indonesia, for example, you'll see that the writing system came from India, as did the Thai writing system, the Burmese writing system, and other writing systems here and there. The writing system came from India, and there were many, many inscriptions in Sanskrit, and Old Javanese is full of Sanskrit words, and even modern Indonesian has quite a few. So it shows you that this culture, which had this caste system, which was obviously discriminatory, that this culture also had enormous influence all over the world, and that its institutions spread. I think one of the reasons for that is that the system is extremely stable. You can't really have a slave revolt in India because you have too many castes, and one caste can't really do that much against this system, which is so stacked against them if they're a low caste. That's beginning to change now. You find now that a lot of these so-called marginalized groups are banding together and asserting political influence. And one thing about that is that the very marginalized groups constitute about 20 to 30% of the population. So it's a sizable group, and they're trying now to use their political power to come up. And they've had some success, but not as much as one would want, because when you're dealing with a system that's so old and so varied in different areas and so complex, it's very hard to change it. Now we come to, why is the West superior? Well, read the Wall Street Journal, they'll tell you. No, but seriously, of course, the West is not superior. It was actually inferior both to the Islamic world and to South Asia and to China through the Dark Ages in any kind of rational way of looking at things. But by the time the 19th century rolled along, the West had become very smug about its accomplishments. And its accomplishments are considerable. I mean, nobody's going to say that the West didn't accomplish anything. But this led to a kind of superiority complex. And a very good example is Macaulay, who was what do they call him? Viceroy of India from 1838 to, that should be 1845, sorry, it's a misprint. I don't know how that happened. And Macaulay said these wonderful things. And incidentally, let's just write something on the board. Yeah. Can you see that? I don't know, it's not very bright. Noblesse oblige. Anybody here know French? Yeah. What's
Rights, privileges.
Huh?
Noble privileges, like
Well, yeah, noblesse is nobility, and oblige means it obligates you, right? So how does it obligate you? Well, if you are a superior white person from Europe, like me, I'm North European descent, which means I have Neanderthal genes in me, unlike most people, and I don't know whether that makes me superior or not. But the whole thing is, of course, idiotic. Nobody is superior to anybody else. But anyway, Macaulay didn't see things that way. And so he saw his job to civilize Indians. Now, here you have a man who's thinking of civilizing a culture which was the world's, along with maybe Chinese, the world's predominant and preeminent culture in the first millennium AD. How can you civilize a culture like that? They might civilize you. Does anybody know Gandhi's famous remark, which apparently he may have actually made? Yeah.
Civilization. Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. Somebody asked him, what do you think, Mr. Gandhi, about Western civilization? He said, it would be a good idea. And, you know, you have to, well, you have to see things relatively, right? But Macaulay didn't see things in any kind of relative way. He said, we must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. Now, if you talk about patronizing people, that sort of is on a whole new level, isn't it? How the hell can you patronize someone to that level? I mean, this would be a joke, except it's real. He really did this, and he really believed this. And, of course, then he had to dump on Sanskrit and Arabic because both of those languages had been used for a long time. Arabic was highly, highly refined. Arabic had more words in it than any other language. I may still. And Sanskrit was used as a language throughout much of Asia, not China so much, but many other parts. But Sanskritic culture did actually have a big effect in China because of Buddhism, which came from India. So that wasn't enough for dear Macaulay. He had to go on. I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, but I have done what I could to form a correct estimate of their value. I have read translations of the most celebrated Arabic and Sanskrit works. I have conversed both here and at home with men distinguished by their proficiency in the Eastern tongues. I am quite ready to take the Oriental learning at the valuation of the Orientalists themselves. I've never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Now, that's kind of fun. I mean, this has been quoted ad nauseum by everybody because it's so extreme. But the amazing thing is that Macaulay meant this. And it gives us a kind of interesting insight into what happens when a country like England, which was when India was, and for that matter, when the Arab countries under the caliphate in Damascus, wasn't it? When they were filled with learning and all sorts of stuff, the English were scarcely civilized. We're probably more or less uncivilized, but that's all right. We don't need to dump on the English either. This is simply something that happens with colonialism, when one group is trying, from a small country, is trying to dominate a group of what? Millions, many, many times larger than itself, and trying to rationalize this. In other words, if, let's suppose, I've always had this dream, what would it be like to actually be a colonial in the 19th century, to sit there with your sideburns and, well, we'll come to that in a minute. I have a couple sort of fun pictures of that. But it's a strange sort of state of mind that you get into, because you know, you see yourself as sort of God's gift to everybody else, but at the same time you're better than everybody else. And it's I would say it's kind of sick, but anyway, that's what it was. Okay, let's go on. Now one of the things, and this actually, now here we get into something which is also part and parcel of colonialism, and that is ideas about race. When we talk about race in the U.S., we generally think back of slavery and the forced importation of so many people from Africa, many of whom died along the way, and who were horribly exploited when they got here. But there's more to it than that, much more. And America is not only guilty in terms of its slavery and its traditions of exploiting non-white people, but it's also guilty in that in the early 20th century, there was this idea of eugenics. And it became very, very fashionable for everybody to believe that somehow a person's racial identity, whatever the hell that is, determines something about what they are in a very basic way. This is something which has been scientifically quite refuted, but this was something which was believed by many people. And in America, there were many so-called scientists who wrote about eugenics. How can we improve the race? Well, don't let people who are mentally problematic, don't let them reproduce. Don't let people who have genetic defects reproduce. So maybe you can sterilize them or something. And this became a rather horrendous but very real kind of thing that people were thinking about. Hitler got some of his ideas from these wonderful Americans, and of course Hitler strongly believed that race was everything and that race determined who you were, and so on and so forth. We're not here to talk about the Third Reich, thank God, but these ideas about race had very awful effects, as we all know. But anyway, to come back to our dear colonials, some of them are rather funny. And here we have, now look at this fellow. I always love to see these pictures of colonials because they're so, you know, I don't know what to say about it. But it's so typical. You know, he has all of his medals there and everything. And this is what he did. He divided people in India into 7 races, which you can see there. And this idea was actually so far out that hardly anybody, he was an anthropologist, by the way, hardly anybody accepted this group. But then people came up with other ideas of what races were there. Now, why would this, we'll come in a little bit to why this is important. Because these things don't go away. They last. You know, it's amazing how these ideas simply refuse to die. But anyway, now what is the corollary of the fact that he has all these races? The corollary is that the great and wonderful English race, which is obviously superior, is another race, and it's separate from all these people. Now, it's kind of interesting because when the English first went into India, actually it was the company that went in, and it was what's it called? Iqbal, what's the company called? Huh?
British East India.
Yeah, British East India Company. Thanks, Iqbal. It slipped my mind. They went in, and basically they wanted to make a profit. And they went into India and they started trying to control things, because how do you make a profit? You control things. But the people who went in were not like these colonials. They intermarried with Indian women. They didn't seem to be so uptight about, genetic, whatever it was, purity or whatever else you want to call it. But by the time colonialism was established and it became official, and it was no longer the British East India Company running things in the 18th century, you began to get this notion of English people being superior. And, whoops, that's not supposed to be there. How'd I do this? Here we are. So here are my pictures. I rather like this picture. Here is a picture. I mean, this is so typical of this period. You see the Englishman dressed up in totally English garb, and this is actually probably fairly toward the end of the British Raj, and his wife, and then you have the Indian servant in the background. I don't know, does anybody know about the Indian genes in the British royal line? Anybody read about that? It turns out that at one point, I forget which one, you can look it up on the internet, one of the ancestors of the kings and queens of England recently, had an Indian servant and had children by them or something or other, and that's part of where the royal line in England comes from. And this was known to the royals, but what they did was they said, oh, it wasn't an Indian woman, it was an Armenian woman. And nowadays, of course, they're not so uptight, and they say, oh, it's fine, we're happy to have Indian blood in us. But in those days, there was this horror of having Indian blood or having any non-white blood in you. And, that was a part of colonialism. And so what you have is you have this layer of white people sort of on top of this huge indigenous group. And there you are. Now, let's go on a little bit more and talk about some, wait a minute. Oops. I think I'm missing one of my slides, but that's okay. I'll just talk about it. One of the things which happens under colonialism is that the whole operation has to be somehow justified. And it has to also not just be justified, but it has to be able to feed itself so it doesn't fall apart. And if you're running a country as huge as India was, and remember that includes both Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, and even Sri Lanka, it's going to take a lot of resources. You got to send people there. You have to have an army to keep people under control. How do you do it? Well, one way you do it is you use the country to your own economic advantage. And how do you do that? Well, if you're in England, you have the Industrial Revolution going on, and you have all these English people, or maybe they're Welsh, or maybe Scots or something, but basically people in the United Kingdom who have jobs making clothes, making cloth. And you've got this huge place, India, where unfortunately for you, you've also got a lot of people making cloth because they've been making cloth there for thousands and thousands of years. So what do? You go in and you put a huge tax on cloth made in India, and you have virtually no tax on cloth made in England. And so people are forced to buy English cloth made in England when they live in India, and all the poor weavers and people in India are out of a job. There's even a story, which apparently is not really true, that they went around and broke the fingers of weavers so that they couldn't weave anymore. But more likely, and what is true, is that they could put a tax on indigenous things in India and try to get people to buy English goods. And that way you have all of this wealth flowing toward England from the colonies. And it's no wonder then that India was called the jewel in the crown, because it was so big and it produced so much. Another thing which is interesting is that many scholars claim that India was becoming industrialized in the 18th century, from 1700 to 1800. And then when it became a colony, everything kind of withered away. And there was not the kind of industrialization and growth that would have taken place had the English not been controlling it. There's also another interesting book that I read about the colonial regime in India, and that leads into what I want to talk about next. I'll try to stop in about a little over 5 minutes. Wait, now I got myself. That is now I lost my train of thought, so let me reset myself. Another thing that happened under the British were many horrendous famines. Now, it's always convenient to blame a famine on the oppressors like the British. We don't really know that whether we can blame them entirely on the British, but they certainly were extreme famines, and they killed an awful lot of people. Now what was happening there was the British were not terribly, I don't think they were too concerned that all these people were dying. This is unfortunately the way human beings are. And so they were more concerned with using the money for their own military than for helping the people who were suffering. One of the worst famines was the Bengal famine. That should be 1943 to 44, not 34 to 44, sorry. I did this in something of a hurry. The lack of political will to divert foodstuffs from the war effort rather than speculation in the sense outlined was mainly responsible for the famine. In other words, the British were fighting a war, and they didn't want to divert the resources away from fighting the Japanese and to helping the Bengalis, and many millions of Bengalis died in that famine. Okay, now I know what I was going to say. Now, when we think about the British Raj, most of us think of a very organized effort, highly bureaucratized, that led to some semblance of order in the population. But a recent book that I read claims quite the opposite. They claim that the British colonials in India were always poorly organized, and they made a mess of almost everything. How in the world, then, did they manage? They weren't that well organized. You can imagine people coming over from India trying to sort of fit into this rather bizarre world of colonials and native peoples and all these different languages and religions and this and that. How did they manage? And here's where the hierarchies come in. There's a story that the first Muslim king to invade North India way back in, I forget what century it was. Huh?
711.
When?
711.
Was that early? I don't think that was. Well, anyway, the story is rather fun, because the story is he visited India, and he looked around and he saw all these people, and he saw, this group is over there, and this group's over here, and that group won't eat with this group, and this group won't eat with that group, and that group is keeping separate from this group. And he said, wow, I can easily conquer these people, because look at this, they're all so divided among each other. And this is exactly the characteristic of South Asian civilization, or one of them, that the British used very effectively. What they did was, remember, if we go back to what we were talking about, trying to remember Macaulay's idea. Let's find a group which we can westernize so that then they can impart their learning to everybody else. And what this group that was there already, and which the British could take advantage of, was the traditional priestly group, the Brahmins. And the reason that they could be taken advantage of was that they had a tradition of very deep learning. And so they could be co-opted into learning English and becoming, at least on the surface, more westernized. And so, because the culture was so divided into different groups, the British were able to manipulate all of the different groups in such a way that they could play one against the other, and they could maintain power in that way. Because let's say you're having the Brahmins, and you're turning them into a group that you're going to westernize and turn into, good sort of proselytizers for Western culture. So you've got the Brahmins there, and then they become westernized. But part of the problem is they're not really going to spread their knowledge to other groups. But on the other hand, their interests now are the same as yours. So that what you do is you co-opt different groups and you make them so that they are dependent on you for their own advancement, and subsequently they will not work for the betterment of the whole culture that they're at the top of, but they will work for you. And this is really what the British did to a large extent. But let's keep going on. Now, the topic of are the Indians, let's not talk about Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, or Sri Lankans for the moment, and just talk about Indians in modern terms. Are Indians better off because the British were there? Here is a question which, of course, has no answer because we don't know what would have happened if the British had never gone. But what we can talk about is the legacy of the British. And the legacy of the British in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh is not enormous, and even Sri Lanka, is not that different. One of the things the British did when they quit India was they allowed the country to be divided. And they divided it on religious lines, as we all know. One part became Pakistan, which was mainly Muslim, and that was modern Pakistan and modern Bangladesh. And the other part became India, which was mainly Hindu. And this was a pretty, not a very, how can I put it? It was a horror, actually, because it resulted in indiscriminate killing on both sides, and many, many people suffered in the mass migration of Muslims into Pakistan or Bangladesh, and Hindus and Sikhs into India. It was a horrible thing, and this is one of the most awful consequences of colonialism in South Asia. But let's go on. But what they left behind also was a functioning bureaucracy, because India was not really run by white people. It was run by a bureaucracy of native Indians or Pakistanis or Bangladeshis. And one of the things is that in India, when the British left, the bureaucracy simply remained. It didn't change much. It just went on. And you got new people running the country who were no longer white Europeans, but the bureaucracy and most of the laws stayed the same. In fact, to this day, there are laws which are holdovers, which are discriminatory laws that came up a little while ago in the news. An old law which is being used by the government of India in a way which many people think violates people's rights, and it's an old British law. But when these countries developed, each one had its own constitution. And the Constitution, it's often said, and this is, to my mind, kind of a stupid thing, but I'll say it anyway, that the Indians who wrote the Constitution thought like white people, and the Englishmen who left India thought like Indians. That's terribly, that's not a nice thing to say, and it's not really true. The people who wrote the constitutions in these countries were, of course, educated in British law, because that had been there for so long, and it was how the place functioned. They didn't have a choice. But they were also very much aware of the specific problems that arose in their own country. For example, caste. The Indian Constitution prohibits caste. The English never did that. So how can you say they were thinking like English people? Well, they weren't. They were thinking like Indians and trying to think how they could create a country that would function and exist in such a way that people were treated equitably, which is easier, of course, said than done. Now, but one of the things which happened in India was that the bureaucracy was highly developed and that all of the central elements of the bureaucracy were there in India. The problem with Pakistan and Bangladesh was that the bureaucracy which was needed to run the countries was really way off in India, and of course it was no longer available to them. And one reason that especially Pakistan has had trouble is that at least this is my own thought, people would obviously argue with any of these things because history is so complex, but one of the reasons that Pakistan has had trouble is that its bureaucracy the local bureaucracy was not strong enough to really cement the unity of the country. And so you had enormously powerful landlords who tended to take over power, and this is something which has plagued Pakistan. And so again, the way the British split up India led to some very bad consequences. I mean, the colonials were, you kind of wonder what they were thinking. They went into the Middle East and they just sort of divided it up into countries at random. We're still dealing with that, right? I mean, look at Iraq. It's divided among Kurds and Sunnis and Shias and people. It's just a total mess. And this is the legacy of the colonials. Anyway, to come back to India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, one of the more interesting legacies of India, of the British, is the language in English. Does anybody know? This is something most people don't know. India is the third largest publisher of English books in the world after the US and the UK. So imagine what that means. Today, English is really a language which more and more people are desperate to learn in India. That's partly because of the United States and the fact that English has become an international language, but it's also because the British inculcated this English education, starting with Macaulay. Let's just stop. I'll just stop. Let's see. Do I have any? Let me see. Do I have anything else? No, that's it. But let me ask. Let's see if we can discuss this a bit, because there are all sorts of issues here which are interesting. The one thing, yeah. Does anybody have any ideas to add? How am I going to get you guys to respond? Yeah.
This is something out of curiosity, but I also know that other Western European powers were involved in the region, whether it was the Dutch East India Company and other colonial powers as well. Did they in any way contribute to this colonial legacy? I mean, did they affect the British institution of colonialism?
Well, of course, yeah. You had a bunch of other things. You had the Dutch in Sri Lanka, You had the French, who were in a couple places like Pondicherry, and you had the Portuguese, who were in Goa. But those places are not big enough for the... I mean, you can still... I remember I met people from Pondicherry who just knew French and Tamil. They didn't know any English. But that's changing now because English is swallowing up everything. It's the ultimate... What can you say? You know, the other interesting thing, as long as nobody else has any, you know, if somebody else has something, put your hand up. But another interesting thing to wonder is what would have happened if the British had never come. After all, let's look at China. China was colonized, but to a much, much less extent. And China seems to have done a better job of coming through the 19th and 20th centuries than India in many ways. And you know, one wonders, suppose the colonists had never been there, what would have happened in South Asia? Of course, we don't know. It might have been worse, it might have been much better. But the one thing we can point out is that the whole episode, in many ways, was not something to be proud of. It had many, many negative, exploitive elements. And it may have had some good consequences, but, you know, one has to, I think, look at it from both sides. Another thing I would say is that India itself is something of a wonder. It has a lot of problems. It has huge corruption. It has other problems. And yet, it also has enormous strengths. It is a country which basically should not exist because it combines, 15, 20 totally different ethnic groups, each with its own history, just like a European country. And yet, it's able to exist as one country. When people talk about the EU, they always say, oh, you know, it can't exist, all these countries can't live together, they have different histories. Well, how about India? The area to million is more different from a UP person than a Swede is from an Italian. And yet India exists as a country. In fact, if you go from Tamil Nadu to Andhra, not only does the language change, but the writing system changes. And you can't read any of the signs unless they're in English. And that's incidentally one reason why English is stuck on, because it's the only language everybody can read. So all of the signs will be in whatever local language is there and in English. And I remember my Tamil teacher who didn't know more than 5 words of English, but he could read all the signs. It was kind of funny in English. Well, anyway, I hope some ideas there are interesting. It was kind of fun talking to you all. And have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank you so much.
This has been a production of Academic Video Services within the Division of Information Technology at Florida International University.